Okay, guys, I think now's a good time to get started. Thanks, everyone, for coming. My name is Erin Watson. I'm a lawyer in the legal department. I'm really happy that my friend Ed could come in to speak today. I would consider Ed to be a pop culture savant, so I appreciate that we have such a broad audience because this is definitely not in any way just about legal stuff. Ed has been all across the country giving this presentation. He wrote this book in San Francisco in a room overlooking the water, spent some time, published it, now it's open source, and he's been traveling all around the United States and also in Europe. He's been to some cool places. He went to Google, he went to Facebook, he's been to Pinterest, and now he's capping off his talk here at Groupon. So this is his epic finale. So please join me in giving a nice warm welcome to Ed and enjoy.
Thank you, Erin, for that very generous introduction, and thank you, Kelly and Melissa, for helping to set up this talk. It's quite a delight for me to be here at Groupon. As Erin mentioned, I've been giving a number of book talks, and they actually started in Chicago last year, and then I went around the country, and then this year I've been fortunate enough to go to several countries in Europe talking about my book. But I really feel grateful that I could end my book tour in Chicago, and what a better place to end it at Groupon. So thank you so much. I really appreciate your time today. Now, I'd like to begin with a story that I'm sure most of you in the room are familiar with. It's a story about a silversmith living in colonial America who made a famous ride on the night of April 18, 1775. The ride began in Charlestown, Massachusetts, and ended up in Lexington, some 13 miles away, lasting approximately 3 hours and ending near midnight. And of course, this famous ride of Paul Revere has become the subject of legends. So I think we all know, one if by land, two if by sea. Excellent. The British are coming, the British are coming. As the poet Henry Wadsworth Longfellow wrote many years after this ride, so through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. Now, there's a small problem with this famous account. It's not true. As the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian David Hackett Fisher wrote in this book, this romantic idea about Paul Revere's ride is etched indelibly upon national memory, but it is not what actually happened that night. Many other riders helped Paul Revere to carry the alarm. Now, even more important than debunking the myths surrounding Paul Revere's ride, Professor Fisher goes on in this book to describe precisely why the American system of communication was so effective that night in sounding the alarm about the incoming British troops. As Professor Fisher describes it, the American system of communication was a decentralized network. It was a network that was coordinated through an openly disorderly network of congresses and committees, but the key was that it had no central authority. It enlisted its churches and ministers, its physicians and lawyers, its family networks and volunteer associations. And if we depicted this network on a network graph, it would look something like this, with Paul Revere and the other midnight riders tapping into the existing communities of Massachusetts. And as noted on that graph, this is just a simulation. This is not to scale. But I think you get the picture of what Massachusetts looked like on that night. Now, for the purposes of today's talk, I'd like to take a few liberties and characterize what you've just seen as a Revere-style network. A network that worked from the bottom up to mobilize people quickly, at least quickly for that time period. So Paul Revere and the Midnight Riders were able to tap into the local groups and communities, and then what happened was that the people in those communities also sounded the alarm about the incoming British troops. And they did so in whatever way they could think of, bells, guns, drums, or the proverbial lantern in the church tower. And this helped to mobilize the American militia, which then scored an important first victory at the battles of Lexington and Concord at the start of the American Revolution. Another important thing to note is that this was in stark contrast to the British system of communication in America, which was completely centralized. If we mapped the British system of communication that existed in America at that time, it would look something like this, a top-down model, or like this, with General Thomas Gage sending a message to one other member of the British Army. And of course, if the message from General Thomas Gage did not find its way to the recipient, the message was lost. And that actually happened at a crucial moment before the battles of Lexington and Concord. Now, I'm sure many of you in the room are wondering, well, what does this lesson of American history have to do with the fight for the future of the internet? Well, if you bear with me for a couple more minutes, I hope to connect the dots. Now, fast forward to January 18th, 2012. We're just past the 2-year anniversary of this historic date, when we saw the largest internet blackout in history, perhaps best symbolized by this image of Wikipedia blacking out all of its English language web entries around the world for a full 24 hours. Imagine a world without free knowledge. I'm guessing some of you in the room saw this on that very day trying to access Wikipedia. But Wikipedia wasn't the only one. Google, for the first time ever in its business history, blacked out its iconic logo. Reddit, the social news sharing site. Mozilla, the maker of Firefox. Craigslist, Wired Magazine, WordPress blogs. Over 115,000 websites blacked out that day as a form of self-censorship, as a way to protest, and also to sound the alarm about something called SOPA, which stands for the Stop Online Piracy Act, which was Congress's latest and greatest efforts to combat online piracy and counterfeit goods. And though SOPA had numerous provisions, the most controversial provision of all was a provision that would have authorized the United States Attorney General to go to court and, based on an allegation that there was some foreign website engaged in criminal copyright piracy or counterfeit of trademark goods, get a court order to direct internet service providers in the United States to block the foreign domain name so that people in the United States could not access that foreign website any longer. It would be kind of akin to having your phone number disconnected. And people in the internet community feared that this would lead to a lot of collateral damage, with a lot of websites being taken down indiscriminately because there were too few procedural safeguards built into this bill. Nonetheless, this had the widespread support of Hollywood and the entertainment industry, multinational corporations, which strongly supported the effort to clamp down on online piracy and counterfeit goods, which were considered to be an increasing problem on the internet. The entertainment industry spent $91 million lobbying on behalf of SOPA just by the date of the first hearing in the House, November 16, 2011. So not surprisingly, the way that our politics works, there was strong support for this bill in Congress. 32 co-sponsors of the bill in the House, and even more in the Senate. Mind you, these are not just supporters, these are the sponsors of the bill who want their names attached to the bill. That's how popular this bill was in Congress. And it was almost unheard of to have nearly half the Senate having their names attached to this bill. So it was fair to say when this bill was first introduced back in October of 2011, it was a slam dunk to pass. The only question was, how soon would it pass? By the end of the year, potentially. But then something amazing happened the day after the blackout, January 19th. By then, SOPA had become toxic. It had become essentially a 4-letter word. Nobody wanted to be associated with it any longer. In fact, in a 24-hour period, the number of opponents tripled. And for the first time in the entire debate, the number of opponents outnumbered the number of supporters for this bill. And even more remarkably, some of the co-sponsors, the people who had their names attached to this bill, they ended up opposing the bill they sponsored. it was really crazy. Take, for instance, Senator Marco Rubio, who's touted to be one of the future presidential candidates for the Republican Party, even in 2016. He came out, he was a co-sponsor of the bill in the Senate. He came out on the very day of the blackout and said on his Facebook page, "We must protect the free and open internet," and SOPA was a potential threat. Likewise, Chris Dodd, the chairman of the Motion Picture Association of America and former senator, said to the New York Times on the day of the blackout, "This is altogether a new effect." And he said that he hadn't seen anything like this in his 40 years of politics, how a bill that had such strong support had quickly changed to such strong opposition in so short amount of time. And he even likened this protest to the protests we saw during the Arab Spring, in which there were protests in Middle Eastern countries and even in a few instances, political revolutions, in part facilitated by people organizing protests through Facebook and Twitter. Now, my view is that Senator Dodd is not entirely correct. He's partially correct about the importance of this internet protest, but he's not correct about the newness of it. For I believe what we saw on January 18th, 2012, is very similar to what we saw on April 18th, 1775. Because in both cases, we had this Revere-style network in which people sounded the alarm. This decentralized network, in order for people to protect their individual freedoms. The biggest difference is that instead of horses, of course, we now have websites for people to sound the alarm, but it's proven to be just as effective as it was on the night of Paul Revere's ride. So on the day of January 18th, millions of people were mobilized from the bottom up to voice their opposition to SOPA. So if we look at some of the numbers, they're quite staggering, and I'm guessing that some of you may have participated in this protest. 8 million people looked up their contact information for their member of Congress on a directory that Wikipedia had created remarkably in 48 hours. They worked round the clock to collect contact information of all the members of Congress so people could conveniently find it on their website. Senators' websites were crashing from all of the attention or traffic directed to their sites. 10 million people signed petitions against SOPA that day. 7 million of those signatures was collected through Google's petition. 3 million people sent emails to Congress against SOPA that day. A lot of these signatures were collected by internet NGOs and nonprofits in the United States. And then over 100,000 people made phone calls to Congress against SOPA on that day. And even though that last number, 100,000, is the smallest number, it may have been the most important number, because as Representative Zoe Lofgren of Silicon Valley continually advised the opposition, you need to melt the phone lines if you want to make a difference. The human voice has a far greater power in Congress than does an email or an online petition. And based on eyewitness accounts of people who visited Congress that day, they said the phones were ringing off the hook in members' offices. And the receptionist told them, people don't like SOPA, which is quite an understatement at the time. If we look at other analytics from that day, they were also just off the charts. Take, for instance, searches for the term SOPA, which didn't mean soup, but it meant, this bill, SOPA. If you could see it, it's a little faint here, but there's an inflection point on January 18th. The searches for SOPA peak on a scale of 100, hitting the 100 mark, the highest you can get on Google Analytics. Likewise, we go to Twitter, the same sort of inflection point. 3.5% of tweets that day were related to SOPA, which for a copyright professor is completely mind-blowing. Never before had this happened in terms of public attention to a copyright bill, which traditionally has been the subject only for lawyers and lobbyists. If we mapped out this universe of people tweeting that day, we can find who were the people tweeting and also receiving tweets about SOPA. So here's the universe of tweets. The blue dots represent tweets being received. The green dots represent tweets being sent out. The bigger the circle, the more tweets being received or sent out. So who were the main recipients of tweets that day? Well, it turned out people were sending the most tweets to the main political actors in this debate, which is, I think, a great sign for our democracy. They were sending it to, first of all, at the top here, this blue dot, that's the White House. In the middle here is Lamar Smith, the chief sponsor of the bill in the House. And at the bottom is Representative Darrell Issa, the chief opponent of this bill in the House. So you can see from those circles, they were receiving the most tweets directed their way related to SOPA that day. And even Kim Kardashian got involved in this debate, tweeting that we must stop SOPA and keep the web open and free. And notice she provides a link to the Wikipedia blackout page where you could also find a set of information about SOPA and what it would do in the view of Wikipedia. So not surprisingly, based on everything that you've just seen, SOPA was shelved 2 days after the blackout, and it hasn't come back. In fact, there is a stigma attached to the term SOPA today in Congress. Members of Congress want to know if this bill is another SOPA, and if it is, they don't want anything to do with it because of the bad connotation with this bill. So if you think about what happened here from January 18th, 2012, I think this is really an incredible story of civic engagement. And no matter where you stand on the actual policy debate, whether you were for SOPA or whether you're against SOPA, I think we all can be proud of this involvement of the people in a policy debate that would affect millions of people in the United States. That, as I said before, this really had never happened before in our over 200 years of copyright legislation and bills, when the American public became actively involved in debating and expressing their views about a copyright bill. And I think that's a healthy sign for our democratic process. And if this were the only story to tell today, I could end my speech at 15 minutes and I could join you for lunch, and I could learn more about Groupon and what's going on today with the deals. But it's actually not the only story to tell. Just as we saw during the Arab Spring, in which political protests in one country of the Middle East helped to spark political protests in another country of the Middle East, we saw the same thing happening with the SOPA protests. As protests in the United States, the SOPA helped to ignite protests in the EU. So a day after the Wikipedia blackout, there was this important meeting in Poland. It turned out to be more important than people thought. The meeting was between the government of Poland and internet activists and NGOs to discuss something called the Anti-Counterfeiting Trade Agreement, which was a trade agreement that the United States, Japan, and EU were pushing to also ratchet up enforcement against piracy and counterfeit goods. And at this meeting, the Polish government basically told the internet activists that ACTA was a done deal. The Polish government was intending to ratify this agreement. And that shocked the people in the room. There was a noticeable silence first when the people in the room learned this, because they felt they had been promised by the Polish government that the Polish government would not sign ACTA until they actually held public consultations so the public could voice its view about ACTA. But that had never happened in the view of the public. And then the meeting was abruptly adjourned. The people fanned out from this meeting and spread the word to the mainstream media in Poland, as well as on their own blogs. And it was widely reported that very day that the Polish government was signing ACTA. And in the reporting of the story, the connection was made directly between ACTA and SOPA, because not only had just the Wikipedia blackout just ended that day, day before, actually hours before this meeting, and also both measures were attempts to deal with online piracy and counterfeit goods, even though they were different in the actual provisions. This led to a dramatic response by people in Poland who responded to ACTA and the news that the Polish government would be signing ACTA by doing this. So spontaneously, protests erupted in over 50 cities of Poland. The video shows the protests in Krakow, where there are over 15,000 people who protested on a night in January in the middle of winter. Over a 2-day span, over 50,000 people protested against ACTA at these various cities all throughout Poland. Basically, their message was, and this you could see on their signs, was no to ACTA. It was that simple. They disagreed with the approach, the process by which it was ratified or sponsored by the government, and they disagreed with some of the substantive provisions, including the chapter dealing with internet restrictions to enforce copyrights. These protests then led to a dramatic response by the government, which a week later then said, wait a second, we're not going to sign ACTA. We will hold public consultations, and ultimately they decided not to sign ACTA. A week later, this influenced the German government, which also said it was suspending ratification of ACTA based on some of the concerns raised by the people in Poland and also internet NGOs throughout Europe. And then a day later, after Germany's announcement, there were mass protests that erupted in 250 cities of Europe, in all 27 countries of the European Union, involving over 100,000 people marching on the streets in these various cities to protest ACTA, with a message similar to this message tying this. You can't see it that well in this photograph, but there's a direct connection made between the SOPA bill from the United States and the ACTA trade agreement in the EU. And also from this sign says the revolution will not be televised. It will, of course, be tweeted. And I think the final striking thing to take away from this photograph, which was taken from Cluj-Napoca, Romania, the young woman is draped in a scarf and winter gear, and there's a mountain of snow behind her with this beautiful landscape as well. And if you go to Google image search and just type in ACTA protests, you'll see dramatic photographs from, I think, all of the cities that protests were held. Or better yet, if you want to see video footage like the kind that I showed you from Krakow, just do the same search on YouTube, and there are so many videos related to the ACTA protests. Okay, if we think about this set of protests along with the protests in the United States, I think it's an incredible story of civic engagement twice over, or maybe 27 times over for all of the countries of the EU. Just as it had really never happened before in the United States to have people involved in copyright debate, it really had never happened before in the EU, certainly not in all 27 countries of the EU, to see a mass public demonstration against a trade agreement, usually the stuff only for lobbyists and trade officials. Not anymore after these protests. So on July 4th, 2012, after the protests were all done, there were actually two sets of protests after the one I showed you. The EU Parliament, the legislative body of the EU, voted overwhelmingly to reject ACTA by a vote of 478 members against to just 39 in favor. And this was the same trade agreement that the EU Commission had already signed on behalf of the EU. So it was something, again, that was rejected by the same government, governing body that had agreed to it. It was remarkable. Okay, so what are the lessons that we can learn from these protests of 2012, what I like to call the Internet Spring? Well, I think the first lesson is a very simple lesson, and that is simply this. Don't mess with the Internet. The Internet community has been, by and large, a sleeping giant in these political debates, but the protests of 2012 show the awesome power that the Internet community can bring to bear on policy debates, especially ones affecting Internet rights and Internet freedoms. Now, lesson number 2 is we, the people, can make a difference. And I'm guessing some of you may be skeptical of this view. I certainly was before these protests, given the way that politics usually operates in the United States. But I think the protests of 2012 showed that we actually really can make a difference in these political debates. People were fighting for this concept of the free and open internet. That's a concept that's not really being defined by courts, at least not yet. It's certainly not being defined by our Congress, which could barely agree upon a budget, let alone, important internet rights and what to protect. This concept about the free and open internet is really being defined by people today. So take, for instance, Aaron Swartz, who said in one of his last public speeches before his untimely death, "We won this fight because everyone made themselves the hero of their own story. Everyone took it as their job to save this crucial freedom, this freedom of the internet. They did whatever they could think of to do. They didn't stop to ask anyone for permission. The senators are right. The internet really is out of control. This Revere-style network." But there are skeptics out there that are still wondering, well, was this protest really based on an informed view? So what do the people really know? Most of the people who protested in the United States and in the European Union were not lawyers, they were not law students. So all the lawyers in the room here know much more about copyright law or First Amendment law than the vast majority of people who protested. So there is this view out there that the reason why there were protests were that simply that there were millions of people who were misinformed about SOPA and ACTA, and they didn't really understand what our First Amendment means and what's the test of the First Amendment and what it should apply in the case of these proposals. So take, for instance, Senator Leahy, the chief sponsor of SOPA in the Senate. He said a day after the blackout, the reason why Wikipedia blacked out was there just simply a lot of false information going on. And that explains why there was this blackout. Now, if you love the internet, you might not like this view that Senator Leahy expressed. But I think it's important to recognize that this view actually is a view that dates back to the founding of our country. It's reminiscent of a view that James Madison discussed in this famous essay, "Who are the best keepers of the people's liberties?" And in this essay, Madison discusses 2 different answers to this question, and he attributes them to the leading political parties of the day. So for the one side, the anti-Republican or the Federalists, Madison attributes this answer to the question: the people are stupid, suspicious, licentious. They cannot safely trust themselves. They should think of nothing but obedience, leaving the care of their liberties to their wiser rulers. So let the elected officials lead and handle the really complicated questions related to copyright law. Now, there's another view out there, and in my view, thankfully, there is another view, and this view is called popular constitutionalism. And under this view, the people's view of the Constitution and individual rights reigns supreme. And it actually reigns supreme even above and beyond the Supreme Court of the United States view, which may be a little bit shocking to lawyers and also others in the room who may be under the more conventional understanding that the Supreme Court decides the law, that decides the meaning of the Constitution. But under this view, that is not true. So to go back to James Madison, the Republican side now says, the people themselves are the best protectors of their liberties. The sacred trust can be nowhere so safe as in the hands most interested in preserving it. Now, my view is that this popular constitutional view better explains what happened in the SOPA and ACTA debates. The people's view of freedom of speech, as they are understanding in this evolving concept about the free and open internet, that is what reigns supreme. And it reigned supreme even though there were really highly technical legal analyses provided by the top lawyers in this country and in the EU. For instance, Professor Lawrence Tribe of Harvard and Floyd Abrams, a leading First Amendment attorney, had competing views on whether SOPA was a violation of the First Amendment or whether it was okay. But those highly technical legal analyses really didn't carry the popular debate. Instead, I think the people applied a more common sense form of scrutiny. They listened to descriptions of SOPA and ACTA, and based on what they heard, they didn't like it. There was too great a likelihood that their legitimate websites would be taken down indiscriminately in this effort to clamp down on piracy. So under that sort of common sense form of scrutiny, both SOPA and ACTA flunked. So in this case, the people made a huge difference in voicing their view about these proposals. Now, the third and final lesson is the power of social media. And really, there are many incredible examples I could discuss today, but in the interest of time, I'm going to discuss only two of them. And the first one is actually, I think, my favorite example of all. It involves a college student from the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee who was 21-year-old at the time when the SOPA bill was being discussed. And Ryan Birchie told me that he was never political in his life. You could barely get him to vote, is the way that he put it. But he read something about SOPA online, and it bothered him. So he decided in his kind of youthful exuberance to get involved, and in his words, to take it straight to the top, meaning President Obama. And luckily, we have a president who has set up this system called We the People, in which anybody can send in a petition to Obama, and if you get a certain number of signatures that meets the threshold, Obama will respond to you. And back then, it was 25,000 signatures. So Birchie writes this petition to Obama, and it says, SOPA is a censorship law that would end the internet as we know it. And he provides a link to his petition on Reddit, and it gets 25,000 signatures in a few days. Ultimately, it gets over 50,000 signatures in a month, so Obama has to respond to it. Another person did a similar petition asking Obama to veto SOPA, and that also got over 50,000 signatures, so over 100,000 signatures in a month related to SOPA. Now, some of you may be wondering, well, what is this 21-year-old college student, a political neophyte, going to do to influence Obama, who had been, by the way, very silent about this bill for the months of debate over the bill, because Obama has strong support from Hollywood and he has strong support from Silicon Valley, and those two sides were on opposite ends of the SOPA debate. But the Obama administration came out a few days before the Wikipedia blackout and said this: we must guard against the risk of online censorship, and the bill as currently drafted could not be supported by President Obama. Echoing some of those same words that Ryan Birchie used, as well as the others in the opposition to SOPA were arguing from the start of when this bill was first introduced. So it's a remarkable way how this small contribution by this unknown college student actually set a chain of events to help crystallize the debate that led to President Obama's coming out against the bill. The second example of the power of social media, I'll go back to Massachusetts, but this time on the western end of Massachusetts, where we have 4 internet activists who've come together to form a new nonprofit called Fight for the Future. And this new nonprofit has one mission. They want to stop SOPA. That's the only reason they come together. Stopping SOPA is what they devote their professional lives to during this period. And they decided after a retreat that their first campaign should be a campaign to educate the American people about how SOPA would lead to collateral damage and stifle legitimate speech. And they used as their first example of how this bill was overbroad an example from pop culture, Justin Bieber. Now, this was before Bieber actually went to jail in Florida, so they were kind of prescient. And they called their campaign Free Bieber. And the basic idea was that there was a part of SOPA that would have criminalized unauthorized streaming of copyrighted material of a value of $1,000 or more if done willfully. And I'm guessing some of you know how Bieber got discovered. He basically started singing other people's copyrighted music on YouTube, and he presumably without permission or without licenses, and he was soon discovered after that, and the rest is sort of history. So the group was arguing that SOPA would make this sort of activity, Bieber's singing of other people's copyrighted music, even that potentially criminal. And they asked people to sign this petition, this Free Bieber petition, and they would post it on their website. They actually had a Free Bieber website, that's where this picture is coming from. In 1 week of launching this petition, this unknown nonprofit that had just formed got over 200,000 signatures in 1 week of launching this petition. So how do you do this? If I asked you, you're very probably tech-savvy people in the room, go out and get me 200,000 signatures in a petition for a petition in 1 week. How would you do that? Well, one source of publicity for their petition came from this YouTuber named Sexy Phil. Phil DeFranco. Do people know Phil DeFranco? Yeah, a few people know. Phil DeFranco has an awesome job. I want this job. His job is basically to comment on the news, kind of like Jimmy Fallon, in a comedic way. And he routinely gets over 1 million views to his videos. And you can see this one almost got 2 million views. And on that day, he talked about the SOPA bill and said how bad it was and how bad it was for the internet. And he provided a link to the Free Bieber petition on the YouTube video page. And that provided a huge amount of traffic to the Free Bieber petition soon after the launch. But Sexy Phil wasn't the main reason why there were so many signatures to the Free Bieber petition. The main reason why was that Bieber himself got involved in this debate, and he said this bill is just ridiculous. He was asked this question by a DJ in D.C. About the SOPA bill. Not only in D.C. would you want to ask Bieber about a copyright bill. For one, he's Canadian, right? And then two, he probably doesn't know what this legislation is about. But the DJ explained it to him, that provision that I talked about the unauthorized streaming of copyrighted material. And Bieber just thought this was simply ridiculous to do, that this activity should be legitimate activity and should be allowed for kids to be able to do this. He said the bill sponsors should be locked up and put away in handcuffs, and that provided a huge boost to the campaign because the mainstream media then just picked this up because Bieber had spoken, and then Bieber fan sites started getting involved after hearing about how Bieber talked about this bill, and that brought a new constituency to the debate. The so-called Beliebers got involved in this debate, and then the traffic sort of exploded to their website, and there were a lot of signatures soon after Bieber's comment. Okay, great. So now that we've learned, I think, 3 important lessons from these internet protests, we can turn to where do we go from here? What next? Well, some of the internet nonprofits, including Fight for the Future, have organized what they call an Internet Defense League. And you can sign up on their website here on their listserv to be on their listserv, and they'll send you out this cat symbol, a riff on the bat symbol, for any time when there's a serious threat to internet freedoms. And they sent this out a few months ago related to the NSA surveillance controversy and held a protest in Washington, D.C. They will also be holding another protest on, I think it's June 5th, there it is, June 5th, 2014, to reset the net. Well, they'll be asking developers and people who program to help program ways to protect privacy and other internet freedoms. So keep on the lookout for this. Meanwhile, there are people, legislators in Congress, who have proposed an Internet Bill of Rights. So these are 2 of the chief opponents to SOPA, have proposed an Internet Bill of Rights actually the day after the blackout, I believe. And you can go to their website called keepthewebopen.com and actually provide comments to the different rights that they proposed to make it better through crowdsourcing. And they've actually changed some of the language in these bills based on comments that people have had. Now, in truth, this bill has no chance of passing Congress, but at least it's a start of a debate in the United States. And this debate is going on in other countries of the world, for instance, in Brazil and the Philippines, which are very close to actually passing a similar sort of bill of rights. But I think you can tell from what I've just stated that in terms of internet freedoms, everything really is still up for grabs. Despite the remarkable successes of the internet protests of 2012, all of them were completely defensive measures. None of them were offensive measures to translate the opposition into recognition, into law of these internet freedoms that people were fighting for. And I need only mention one word again to underscore how precarious our internet freedoms are. NSA, surveilling our email and contact information as we speak. But I think this leaves us then with a profound challenge, but also really an incredible opportunity, because you too can be like the Midnight Riders and sound the alarm about the threats to freedoms that you hold dear. They don't have to relate to the internet. They could be anything or any issue that you really believe strongly in. You could join in a common effort in the cause of freedom, to borrow again the words of Professor Fisher from his book. Now, I know that there are still skeptics out there about this movement to protect internet freedoms. And it's not mainly from people who don't believe in these freedoms, but they don't believe in, like, why should they have to spend their time fighting for this? And I've given this talk over 25 times in the United States and in Europe, and sometimes this question pops up. Why should I get involved in this fight for internet freedoms? Well, to answer this question, I was reminded about an interview that someone did of one of the soldiers who fought in the American Revolution for the American side. His name was Captain Levi Preston. And this interview took place many years after he had fought, and of course we know how the American Revolution turned out. And the interviewer first asked him, Captain Preston, why did you fight? Was it this notorious Stamp Act of Great Britain that required all printed materials in the United States to be printed on special paper from Britain, essentially a tax on all printed material in the United States? And Preston said, I don't have any stamps. So the interviewer asked him again, well, was it the tea tax, the tax on tea that Great Britain imposed on tea in the United States that led to the Boston Tea Party, in which Paul Revere and other patriots of the United States dumped tea into the Boston Harbor as a form of protest? And Captain Preston said, I don't like tea. You can tell he was a man of very few words, kind of near and dear to my heart. So the interviewer asked him a third time, well, was it then the writings on individual liberty by John Locke and other political theorists of our day? And Preston said, I don't know those guys. So the interviewer was kind of exasperated at this point and asked him, well, just tell us why you fought. And then here's what Preston had to say. We had always governed ourselves in America, and we had always meant to. The British didn't mean we should, and that's why we fought. And that's why I fought. And I think in a similar way, that's what we saw happening in 2012. People around the world, United States and European Union, were fighting for this concept of the freedom of the internet. They were fighting for this concept of the internet that they grew up with, this decentralized Revere-style network that looked like this, not under the control of a government, not under the control of corporations, but open and decentralized for people to use. And people were fighting against this vision of the internet that looks like this British model of communication, the top-down model, under the control of a government or under the control of a corporation. And that's what people feared would happen with SOPA and ACTA. They were opening the door to greater government policing and control of the internet. Now, I want to end here, and I hopefully will end with a note of optimism, because I'm an optimistic person by nature. But if you think about what happened in the protests of 2012, how we, the people, can and actually did make a difference in these political debates, and how the internet provides us with incredible tools through social media to help us fight for our freedoms, this fight for the future of the internet, it's really ours to win. We just need to go out and make it happen. Thank you. Okay, we have time for a few questions, I think. Anybody have a yes?
Last one. So
I think there's a mic they want to get you.
Awesome. So I guess the question that I have is, obviously the response to things like this, when there's any sense of censorship or something like that, whether it's internet-based or something like that, everybody's natural emotional reaction is to fight it. But as the comments were saying, that maybe everybody doesn't know the real truth behind this, or they don't know the emphasis behind the bill. So it's often fear-based response, and not that that's a bad thing, but where should people go for things like this to actually get the true facts for things like this? I mean, nobody wants to sit down and read a 900-page bill. I know I wouldn't. So what's the best resource for people to use to actually get those facts?
I think the best resource is the internet. They can go to the internet. No, that's a great question. One thing that I'll say first of all is that during the SOPA debate, there were many people who are not lawyers and not educated in the law who were actually reading the bill and providing commentary on Reddit, for instance. The Reddit community was analyzing the bill with a lot of scrutiny. So I think that's really, some people go directly to the proposal and they try to understand it themselves. And I think that's a good, place to start, at least for some who want to try to take the time to understand it better. But most people aren't going to have the time as well as the patience to do that. So where do you go to get your information? I think the internet NGOs, the internet nonprofits, did it like EFF, Public Knowledge, Fight for the Future. There were a bunch that were following this, provided a wealth of information about the bill. And then there were academics who provided legal analyses of the bill. I mentioned Professor Tribe from Harvard, and then the competing memo from Floyd Abrams. I don't want to say that you get all of your information from one side, but there was a wealth of information, people analyzing the bill so that even the uneducated in terms of law could have access to some really, deep, knowledgeable analysis of it, of the bills and the pluses and minuses of it. So I guess I would recommend looking at some of the internet nonprofits, websites, as well as seeking out support the opponent's side. And one thing about it was that because Hollywood thought this bill was a slam dunk, they really did not have a good PR strategy. They didn't think that they needed to really explain this bill in great depth, and they just kind of poo-pooed the opposition's arguments and saying, "Oh, that's not true. That's not true," But they didn't, I think, address it in a kind of substantive manner, saying, "Well, here's why this provision won't take down Justin Bieber's videos."
Okay. I read a study recently about how there's also kind of the concept of connectors in a network. How often there's kind of key points in the network where,
Yes.
if it doesn't go to that point, it doesn't get to the other half of the network. So if you thought about with these corporations, what if there was an issue that was in the best interest of the people, but it was not in the best interest of, say, Google or Facebook, and that tends to be a big central part of the network? How would that impact your reviewer-style network if they don't kind of pass it on?
Right. That's a great question. I'll go back to this image. You could imagine some of these big circles representing a Google or Viacom, for instance, being able to control a lot of dissemination of information, and how will that affect the fight? I think that does intersect with the issue of net neutrality and trying to keep the internet access open and equal, so that people and innovators, startup companies like Groupon used to be, could have the same platform as the biggest companies, Google, et cetera, whatever. So that's one of the freedoms that people are actually fighting for in the Internet Bill of Rights. That's very important to maintain. And I think by and large it's been pretty effective in keeping the internet decentralized and open to all comers on an equal basis. And I think that was borne out by a study that the Harvard Berkman Center did related to SOPA. So they looked at the amount of linking to websites related to the SOPA debate, and what they found in their analysis, which you can find on the internet, is that during the debate, small unknown websites like Fight for the Future had several websites, became key players in this debate when the amount of links to their website was the most during the period, even beyond mainstream media, even beyond some well-known established websites. So I think based on the Berkman Center analysis, there's reason to be happy about what had happened in that debate, but that doesn't guarantee in the future that there can be more speed bumps or roadblocks set up by corporate big conglomerates to sort of control how access is distributed. Yes.
What do you think this conversation looks like in countries where the internet's restricted? So for instance, in China, or even worse, in North Korea, how are people, mobilizing when the main pathway to do so is limited, censored, monitored, or non-existent in some cases?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know much about North Korea, but in China, it's interesting because I've had the good fortune of having a few students from China hear my talk and give me some of their impressions, and some of them want to know how they could help change the internet policy in China. And I'm usually pretty sensitive to making suggestions like that because I don't want to put anybody in danger, in terms of like their own lives and liberty, so to speak. So I think there's certainly an element in China thirsting for an open internet, and eventually maybe we'll see that. I mean, parts of China, they were discussing maybe in Shanghai there would be this free trade zone. It'd be more liberal use. Maybe you could access Facebook. That never happened, but there was at least some talk of it. So, I think the government is able to effectively clamp down on the internet in ways that we would not allow because of the First Amendment here. But then I think there's another side to the censorship in China that's pretty interesting. There was a Harvard professor that did a study about censorship in China, and it turns out a lot of content is allowed in China. Certainly some American websites are blocked, Facebook, Google, New York Times, etc. But in terms of messages on social media and messages on websites in China that are approved, the Chinese government allows a lot of criticism of the government. It's mainly when people start talking about organizing political protests or organizing demonstrations. That's censored. That gets off the internet very quickly. So, I think the picture in China is a very complex one, and I mean, ultimately, hopefully, we would see more openness. And my belief is that the effort to protect the free and open internet, will start in other countries, and it may not even be the United States first. It may be other countries, and then that will help to at least raise the issue in other countries, and it may spread to the countries that are more restrictive. Other questions? Oh, there's a question back there.
I have a question about after seeing that sort of arresting footage of the demonstrations in Poland, whether you have any thoughts or if you could talk about the relative, fervor or militancy of protests in Europe versus those in the United States in response to SOPA and ACTA. Because even with the spying, you see there's been heftier, significant online organizing, but sometimes it hasn't translated into physical demonstrations in the United States in a way it has in other countries. I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I think there are a couple different factors that make real sort of on the streets protests in Europe more easy to do. One certainly is the tradition of protesting in a number of these countries, especially in Poland, where I've been told, based on the people I interviewed, there is a rich tradition of protesting even before the days of solidarity, but certainly during the days of solidarity against the communist government, protest on the streets was the primary way to protest the communist regime. And you could see that dramatically, I think, in the video footage of just, this is something that is part of the culture of Poland. So I think that's one thing. Another thing I think is physically, in many of these cities and towns, it's much, I think, more centralized. Like there's a town center and people don't necessarily have cars, they use public transportation. So it's not as spread out as many of our cities are in the United States, where, for instance, having a protest in LA, like how would you do that? How would you get people in LA? It might be easier in Chicago to do it, but in LA it's so spread out, even though that's so close to Hollywood, which would be a great place possibly to have a protest. And then the final thing is, I think in terms of the issue related to online censorship, I think the memories of people in Europe about communist regimes is still strong. And, probably in a country like the United States, we're not as accustomed to thinking that the government is censoring us. Maybe in the days of McCarthy, we could go back to them. But we usually don't think, okay, our government is censoring us. Whereas I think in Poland or some of the other countries that were Eastern European countries, that happened not too long ago in their view. So the idea that the government would start authorizing this greater policing of the internet drew this sort of visceral reaction, the fear, exactly. It drew the fear of people that, oh my goodness, people were not going to be able to have our favorite websites. And one added wrinkle to this active protest that was sort of bad timing for the United States. The United States government helped to orchestrate the shutdown of Mega Upload on the very day after the Wikipedia blackout in New Zealand. Now, if you want to shut down Mega Upload, you shouldn't shut it down after Wikipedia has just blacked out their site and the entire internet has been standstill. And that scared people in Europe who thought, well, the United States government, there's this bill called SOPA, and now the United States government is shutting down Mega Upload. They can do that. And that, to me, the people who talked to me about what they did for the protest told me that was another motivating factor because they just thought this is not the way that the internet should operate. Okay, so one last thing I'll mention is that on this website for the book, there is a free copy of the book, PDF, in the About section, and there's also a link to where you can buy an ebook or a paperback version of it as well. So, thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.